Qyburn had always been a man of singular focus, a physician-scientist whose curiosity overrode the boundaries of ethics or the laws of men. In the cramped laboratory he had fashioned below the Red Keep, the torchlight flickered over countertops strewn with the paraphernalia of his experiments. Silver scalpels, glass vials, cork-stoppered bottles, and the faintly luminescent jars of leeches and oddities he had collected. Though he had earned a dark reputation with his previous work on reanimation and necromancy, what he pursued now was equally sinister, if more mundane in origin. He traced his finger across an ancient treatise, a worm-eaten tome filled with references to diseases lost to time. At first glance, anyone would have taken it for mere medical curiosity, an attempt to discover new cures for old ailments. But Qyburn's intentions were not so benign. He had come upon the idea slowly, nurtured by the chaos that prevailed in King's Landing whenever a hint of disease spread among its filthy alleyways. The city was always teetering on the brink of sickness. Too many bodies crammed into too little space, too few priests and septas to administer help, too little gold for the poor to find healing. Maladies flared up after each shift in temperature, after each new wave of refugees flooded in from distant wars. It was a tinderbox of infection. Qyburn merely needed the right spark to set it ablaze. He had tried smaller tests first, neatly done, quietly administered. A whore found coughing up blood by the hook, a dockworker who collapsed near the fish market, an urchin who convulsed near an abandoned warehouse. Isolated incidents, each one brushed off as some random misfortune of the unfortunate. But Qyburn carefully observed the aftermath. He studied how the city's healers responded, how the poor scurried away from the afflicted, how the gold cloaks either beat them back or steered them toward the flea-bottom gutters. The city responded with apathetic shrugs and mild alarm, not yet stirred to genuine panic. These small tests allowed Qyburn to refine his toxin, to measure precisely how quickly it incapacitated a body and how swiftly it spread from one victim to the next. He had discovered to his grim satisfaction that it was neither the swiftest nor the most horrifying illness he could conjure, but it had the capacity to spread silently, leaving its carriers as unsuspecting vessels for further infection until symptoms arose too late. While he prepared these initial attempts, Qyburn had disguised himself behind the facade of the royal advisor to Queen Circe. To all appearances, he was but the quiet confidant who had once wrested monstrous secrets from death itself and created her loyal champion, Sir Robert Strong. His closeness to the Queen granted him access to the Red Keep's resources, and, more important, its secrets. He had discovered dusty tomes in the Maester's Tower detailing the quarantines of old, from the great spring sickness to the shivers, each epidemic described with cautionary detail. How to isolate the infected, how to burn corpses, how to keep entire city gates locked. Qyburn read these with rapt attention, gleaning new insights into how a metropolis might respond to widespread disease, and how unprepared the city had been during the darkest times in Westeros's history. Even in the presence of the Citadel's knowledge, even with the faith's blessings, each plague had wrought untold misery. It was no wonder that the small folk referred to these times with fear and superstition. In cramped taverns of Flea Bottom, aged men and women recalled the last dreaded outbreak. Their stories told of chaos and the pungent stench of death, how the silent sisters and grave diggers worked ceaselessly, and how the rats scurried in the alleyways, grown bold enough to scavenge freely upon half-dead bodies. But Qyburn noted that with each plague, there came a reorganization of power, a culling of the masses, a shift in who survived. The potential for destruction might pave the way for new control if one knew how to direct the chaos. So began his real experiment. It started with a single vial. Within that delicate glass container, Qyburn had brewed a concoction derived from the old treatises on hemorrhagic fevers and from his own experimentation with corrupted animals. The plague he envisioned would not strike its victim down immediately. That would be too obvious, too quickly traceable. Instead, it would fester, travel from one host to the next, multiplying in city dwellers before the first symptoms emerged. By the time they felt a twinge of sickness, they would have infected friends, family, neighbors, and strangers in the streets. Then the plague would bloom in King's Landing like a poisonous flower. But what end did Qyburn hope for? Perhaps not even he fully understood what final shape his ambitions might take. Some days, in his more lucid moments, He told himself he did this to test the boundaries of knowledge, to unlock secrets that maesters refused to explore. Other days, he believed it might be a tool, a show of power that could be unleashed to quell rebellion or exert the queen's control. And on the darkest nights, when he saw the blood of his first victims glimmering in candlelight, he suspected there was something else inside him, something that merely enjoyed seeing how far he could push the line between life and death. He wanted to see how it spread, if it might move from one infected rodent to the next, if the bites and scratches they inflicted could act as a vector. After all, rats were an excellent measure of how quickly a disease might spread in the labyrinth of King's Landing. When two of the rats began to convulse, Qyburn merely watched with clinical detachment. The next day, all three were dead. It was too fast for his liking. The plague must be slower. He wanted the city to be infected thoroughly before panic took hold, before the highborn or the clerics recognized the threat. So he returned to the tome, adjusted proportions, diluted the more lethal components. Days blended into nights as Qyburn refined his brew. When at last he found the perfect balance, he was satisfied. The rats lived for 2 days, apparently stable, walking on trembling legs, their bodies racked with fever, yet they scuttled about, biting at their cagemates and clawing the straw floor. Only on the third night did the creatures collapse into stiff heaps, eyes crusted with bloody discharge. Qyburn, for once, allowed himself a thin-lipped smile. That was precisely the window he desired. He needed a vector now, someone unremarkable, a vessel that might wander through Flea Bottom, the street of steel, the markets near the Mudgate, perhaps a brothel or two in the alleys. He needed that vessel to come into contact with many, yet remain unnoticed. It would be best if it was a person of meager means, a body easily discarded when the plague had run its course. Qyburn planned every step meticulously, even the final disposal. He took a coin purse from a locked chest, heavy with gold, and prepared to scout the city. Before dawn, he ventured out disguised in rough-spun garments, a cloak of patchy cloth that reeked of mildew. He passed guards with nary a glance, for they had grown accustomed to beggars and the Red Keep's lesser staff trudging in and out for errands or menial tasks. Once he was beyond the shadow of the castle walls, he made his way into the labyrinth of King's Landing. Few in the capital recognized Qyburn's face. Those who knew of him chiefly pictured him in his black robes within the keep, overshadowed by the Lannisters or flitting near the Queen. To the average resident of King's Landing, he was just another stranger among thousands. He went into an alehouse near the Gate of the Gods, where the stench of stale beer and unwashed bodies hung thick in the smoky air. Eyes squinted in the gloom as he surveyed the patrons, searching for a candidate. He wanted someone desperate, someone who would jump at the chance to earn a few coins for minimal effort, no questions asked. He found an older boy with a scrawny frame, might have been 15 or 16, face pocked with scars from an earlier illness. The youth looked half-starved and had a desperate gleam in his eyes when he glanced at Qyburn's coin purse. Qyburn beckoned him over, slid a few coppers across the table, and spoke in a low voice. He told the boy that he needed him for a day's labor, that it would pay more than he'd earn in a month scrounging about these streets. The boy's suspicion flickered only momentarily. Hunger won over caution. He nodded and followed Qyburn. They traveled to a deserted storeroom in the lower city, where Qyburn kept additional medical supplies. The scrawny boy eyed the goods, likely wondering if he could steal them. Qyburn sensed the youth was already scheming, but it mattered not. He told the lad he had a cough, faking a small, congested sound, and needed someone to brew a special remedy that he would pay him to fetch from 3 different apothecaries around the city. If they refused, the boy was to claim it was for a wealthy patron. He gave him some coppers, enough to buy the alleged ingredients. He handed the youth a jar with a cunningly disguised false bottom containing the plague solution. He instructed him to show the jar to each apothecary, so they might read the label before measuring the remedy. The boy cocked an eyebrow, asked why it needed so many complicated steps, but Qyburn put a silver stag in his hand. That ended the boy's curiosity. Qyburn said that if he returned with the jar half full of the mixture, Qyburn would provide double the silver. The boy left with fervent determination, the promise of reward bright in his eyes. Unbeknownst to him, that jar's false bottom had a tiny stopper. Removing it released a faint, nearly undetectable vapor carrying the contagion. In each apothecary, or in any shop he chose to wander into, he would leave behind a trace of the plague. And in handling the jar, the boy too would become contaminated, ready to spread it to whomever he bumped into on the crowded streets. From there, the disease would fan out. In a few days, the boy might develop mild symptoms, but by then he would have infected countless others. Qyburn did not expect him to survive. The real question was whether he'd pass it on well enough to set the entire city ablaze. Over the next week, Qyburn waited. He went about his duties in the Red Keep, quietly advising the queen on matters of coin and trade, trifles that masked his true purpose. He kept an ear out for rumors of an outbreak, murmurs among the serving staff, gossip from the Red Keep guards who'd come off shift in the city. Word of disease usually traveled quickly in King's Landing, where folks died daily in the slums. The turning point was hearing the day's small folk talk in the Great Hall. How a certain apothecary had fallen ill, how a tavern near the Street of Flower had closed after the owner coughed blood into a patron's ale. Then he heard of a whorehouse that shut its doors unexpectedly, and the whores were rumored to be dropping like flies. Still, it was only rumors. No official proclamations yet, no citywide panic, but those seeds of fear had begun to take root. Qyburn took to patrolling the city, again in his humble disguise. He had to see for himself how the plague was progressing. He walked through Flea Bottom, where the gutters always reeked of waste. He saw ragged children huddled around fire pits, scrawny men hawking stolen wares, and gaunt-eyed women leaning in doorways. Some coughed openly, a wet, hacking sound. Perhaps that was just the usual state of misery in Flea Bottom, or perhaps they were indeed among the first wave of infected. He lingered long enough to watch an old man slump against a wall, face slick with sweat. When a passerby asked if he was well, the old man spat a glob of phlegm tinted pink. A hush fell over the onlookers. No one dared approach him after that. Farther up the Street of Steel, where the blacksmiths hammered out swords and horseshoes, Qyburn saw something that heartened him. A skilled blacksmith's apprentice shivering uncontrollably as he tried to stoke the forge. The master blacksmith cursed him for his laziness, only to draw back in dismay when he saw the droplets of blood on the boy's lips. Meanwhile, in front of a bustling bakery, an urchin vomited and collapsed with a groan. Bystanders recoiled, some covering their mouths with scraps of cloth. Others darted away, unwilling to risk contamination. Yet, in most quarters of the city, commerce continued. The masses saw these incidents as just another disease that might pass in time, or a wave of fevers that would kill a few unfortunates. They had lived through hunger, through the War of the Five Kings, and through unrelenting tyranny from lords and queens. A handful of sickly wretches was not enough to stop them from their daily hustle. Still, Qyburn observed the subtle signs. Fewer wagons at the market, fewer vendors hawking produce, crowds thinner in the squares. Word was spreading that something foul was afoot. By the 10th day after the boy began his mission, half a dozen city watchmen and at least 3 gold cloaks within the Red Keep had fallen ill. They discovered that several more men at arms were coughing, and panic began to stir among them. One by one, guards called in sick, shunning their duties to nurse their fevers at home. The captain of the gold cloaks, confused by the sudden wave of illness, appealed to the Red Keep's healers for an explanation. The healers were likewise mystified, calling upon the city's maester to diagnose them, though the old man insisted it might be a new strain of flux or consumption. But Qyburn knew better, and he could not hide his glee. He manipulated events behind the scenes, quietly suggesting to the queen that these were but mild incidents, that the men needed rest and perhaps better sanitation. He did not want an overreaction, yet he needed the infection to spread more thoroughly before the entire city moved to quarantine. In hushed words, he told Cersei that any rumors of plague should be silenced lest it provoke unrest or weaken her position. That was enough to keep official investigation to a minimum. As the days turned into weeks, the plague's spread became impossible to ignore. The first wave had developed coughing fits, and the second wave began to show advanced symptoms. bloody sputum, high fevers, splitting headaches, and rashes along the arms and chest. The city's healers were overwhelmed. Everywhere they went, men and women besought them for cures. Alleyways turned into clinics of despair, as families huddled around their sick, praying for relief. Temples opened their doors, but the ranks of the devout soon thinned as septons and septas themselves succumbed. The smell of incense mixed with the stench of vomit. Even the silent sisters were pressed to their limit, carting bodies to the outskirts of the city for burial, or burning them when disease seemed too virulent. Still, no official decree had come to isolate the infected. The Queen's Council members argued among themselves. Some said to quarantine entire neighborhoods, but others believed that would spark riots. A few suggested closing the city gates so no one could leave or enter, to contain the disease while it ran its course. But mercers and merchants objected, for that would cripple trade, starve the city, and raise suspicion among the lords outside. Rumors of plague might encourage rebellious bannermen to think King's Landing had grown vulnerable. And so they delayed, arguing day after day, while the sickness found new hosts. Qyburn observed it all with an unblinking gaze. Some nights he revisited his hidden storeroom, dissecting the corpses of those who had died. He charted the progression of lesions on the lungs, the internal hemorrhages in their organs. He realized that though the plague was not as immediately fatal as the grayscale or other fabled diseases, it proved relentless. Those who survived the first stage often lingered in an excruciating second stage, their fevers burning their minds, leaving them delirious and shrieking in confusion. By the time they reached the third stage, they slipped into comas or died abruptly, sometimes in the midst of a racking cough. He carefully noted each new variant he saw in the bodies, each small mutation that might accelerate or slow the progression. Then he returned to the Red Keep, the mask of a concerned advisor once more on his face. After 4 weeks, the city had begun to take on a new aspect. The streets were quieter, for people were afraid to stray far from home. Shutters remained closed, rickety doors barred from within. Neighbors scarcely dared to visit one another. A sense of foreboding clung to the narrow lanes. If a wail of distress pierced the air, passers-by hurried away rather than investigate. The homeless died where they lay, for fear of touching them outweighed any sympathy. Rats grew bolder, feeding on refuse in broad daylight, sometimes on the dead themselves. In the Red Keep, the tension was palpable. Servants squabbled, allegations of sickness were made at the slightest cough, and the kitchens faced shortages of fresh produce, as fewer carts arrived from the countryside. The Queen's Council convened daily now. Grand Maester Mellon, an aging man with watery eyes, insisted that the gates must be closed. A formal quarantine declared. The city watch had begun deserting, trying to flee to the countryside with their families. He pleaded that if the capital lost all semblance of order, looting and chaos would soon follow. Circe, uneasy but unwilling to reveal the city's desperation, hesitated. She loathed the idea of sealing King's Landing from the outside world, for fear it would appear a sign of weakness. And if the disease had not yet spread outside, as some courtiers insisted, then foreign trade and traveling knights might still be dissuaded from approaching if they knew the city was plague-ridden. She turned to Qyburn for advice. He, playing his role masterfully, suggested that she impose a partial quarantine, close some districts, such as Flea Bottom, from venturing into the wealthier wards, and keep out suspicious travelers. Encourage cleanliness, let the faith handle the spiritual side, and rely on the gold cloaks to maintain order. Circe agreed. And so began the city's official half-measures, which only truly accelerated the crisis. The guards constructed makeshift barricades to isolate Flea Bottom, the worst of it, but it was impossible to fully police the labyrinthine alleyways. Smugglers and desperate families found ways to slip in and out. The tension within that quarantined area skyrocketed. People clamored at the barricades for help, for bread, for medicine, but the guards refused them. Skirmishes erupted. A few gold cloaks were pelted with rotten fruit, or with dead rats, which by this time had also begun to carry the plague. In the confusion, some guards came down with fever themselves, and more fell ill behind the barricades. Qyburn listened to the torrent of new developments with a measured calm. This was precisely the crucible he had imagined. The city's population turning on itself, fear surging through the hearts of even the powerful. More worrying to him, however, was that the plague was creeping closer to the Red Keep. Some of the queen's handmaids reported that one of their number had not woken one morning. Her skin pale, her lips flecked with blood. A minor lord visiting from the Reach fell ill after dinner with the queen, though Qyburn suspected the real exposure had happened in the city, not the keep. All the same, rumors grew that the disease was now inside the palace walls. Cersei's nights were restless. She paced the corridors, hissing at any guard or servant who dared cough in her presence. She demanded constant updates from Qyburn, demanding to know what unnatural trick he might conjure to stop this affliction. He concocted some mild tonics to reduce fevers and ease coughs, but none were an actual cure. She insisted that he try everything, even the darkest arts, to protect her and the castle. Qyburn assured her he was searching for a solution. He had no intention of revealing that he was the source of the plague. Now, the plague no longer needed fresh carriers or infected jars. It was self-sustaining. A single droplet coughed onto a table or door handle might infect half a dozen new people. The economy ground to a halt. The coinage that changed hands in the city's few open markets carried invisible death upon it. The faith was powerless. The seven seemed silent, or so the devout claimed in despair. If the city had previously been anxious, it was now on the verge of madness. Funeral pyres burned day and night on the outskirts, the air thick with greasy smoke and the smell of burnt flesh. Some fled the city if they could bribe or force their way out of the gates. Others holed up in cramped dwellings, living off whatever provisions they had, hoping the plague would pass them by. In Flea Bottom, it was rumored that entire families lay dead in their hovels, and that the living no longer bothered to bury their kin. The partial barricade became a joke, as more died behind it each day. The gold cloaks who remained loyal tried to keep order, but they were understaffed and fearful. Riots erupted. A group of starving mothers demanded bread at the storehouses, only to be beaten back. Within days, the storehouses were set on fire by saboteurs. The flames leapt from building to building, unstoppable in the cramped district. A large swath of Flea Bottom went up in smoke. Ironically, the fire may have killed as many rats as it did people, momentarily slowing the plague's spread in that part of the city. But the heartbreak was incalculable. At last, the queen had no choice but to listen to the counsel of her advisors. Over the objections of those who prized commerce, Cersei gave the order. Lock down the city, close the gates completely, no one in or out. The entire city was under quarantine. The official decree was nailed to public boards across the capital. The hammered words were clear. Those who attempted to flee would be treated as traitors. Those who harbored infected persons without notifying the Red Keep would also be punished. The city watch was to ensure that the plague was contained, that no ships left Blackwater Bay or the city's docks. King's Landing had become a prison of fear. The wide roads leading to the city gates were blocked with spiked barriers, manned by anxious guards wearing makeshift cloth masks, forced to confront any who approached. The harbor was lined with warships loyal to the crown, their ballistae pointed at any vessel that attempted to leave. The plague was an invisible invader, and by shutting the gates, the queen had effectively locked it in with her people. As the quarantine days stretched on, the city's population found themselves in an ever-tightening vice. Food grew scarce, especially fresh foods. The harvest wagons from the Riverlands and the Crownlands had stopped coming, trapped outside the gates. The city's granaries held some reserves, but unscrupulous merchants hoarded provisions to sell at exorbitant prices. Most small folk could not afford such luxuries. Rumors spread of men killing each other over a sack of barley, of mothers offering desperate favors just for a bit of salted fish. In the gloom of night, the plague's victims moaned, coughed, and died in their lonely corners. Qyburn watched all this from his vantage point. He continued to discreetly tend to the queen's concerns, even as she grew more paranoid. She demanded to know how to save the city, how to protect herself. She forbade any who showed the slightest sign of sickness to come near her. Even her own ladies-in-waiting were replaced with fresh faces after one coughed in her presence. The queen retreated to her private chambers, seeing fewer people each day. Meanwhile, Qyburn stoked her fear, offering half-truths about how to stave off the disease. He gave her potions to keep her calm, but not enough to dull her wits. He fed her illusions, speaking of a cure that might be found if only he were granted more resources, more subjects to test. She was desperate enough to agree, so Qyburn began gathering living test subjects. The Red Keep's dungeons were never short on criminals, men accused of treason or thieves. He selected the healthy ones, forcibly exposing them to infected rags or the bodily fluids of those dying from the plague. Then he tried different concoctions to see if any might stave off the disease. It was a grim process, reminiscent of his prior experiments, and the captives wailed in horror, cursed him as a demon, or prayed fervently for a swift death. Rarely did any of them survive longer than a week, but Qyburn meticulously noted every sign, every reaction. From time to time, a prisoner's fever would subside unexpectedly, and Qyburn thought he might have found a flicker of hope, but within days the victim inevitably relapsed or died. Still, the queen seemed relieved that he was working on something. She needed to believe a cure was possible, and he was willing to keep her believing for as long as it served him. When asked for updates, he told her he needed more time, more men. So she allowed him to requisition gold cloaks to apprehend the sick or suspicious from the city and bring them to the keep's lower cells. At first, the watch was reluctant, but eventually, those men too realized they stood a better chance of survival inside the keep than on the streets. Qyburn's dark laboratory expanded, filled with the stench of infected bodies and a chorus of agonized moans. The city's forced quarantine changed the very fabric of daily life. With movement restricted, some aristocrats barricaded themselves in their manors, turning away servants or anyone suspected of infection. They had stockpiled food and wine, but even they began to realize that wealth was meaningless if the plague's tendrils could slip past their gates. Some tried to bribe the watch to let them out of the city, but the queen's decree stood firm, and the watch was commanded to accept no bribes under penalty of death. Still, a few guards took the risk, smuggling out the highest bidders under cover of darkness, leading them through secret tunnels or letting them scale the walls at the cost of a fortune. Word reached Cersei's ears, and she demanded heads for this treachery, but by then it was too late to stop it entirely. Some escaped, no doubt carrying the disease with them into the countryside. Qyburn was particularly interested in how news would spread across Westeros if the city gates were forcibly shut. Sooner or later, travelers would reach other towns, telling horrifying tales of a plague-ridden capital. That alone would strike fear into the hearts of the realm, perhaps shake allegiances. Winter was looming, and no one wanted to risk trade with a diseased city. The more isolated King's Landing became, the more desperate it would grow. Qyburn wondered if, at some point, the great houses might intervene. If the plague's devastation became too great, if the monarchy looked weak, some lord might try to claim the throne in the midst of chaos. But for the time being, King's Landing remained locked in a slow, agonizing struggle. Days bled into one another. The city's population dwindled. Carts of corpses trundled along the main thoroughfares, accompanied by crows that circled overhead. The Grand Maester tried distributing herbal poultices to the poor, but they had little effect beyond meager comfort. The Septons prayed day and night, arms outstretched to the Seven, but the plague continued its course. All the while, Qyburn documented its progress, satisfied with the scale of his unholy experiment. Meanwhile, rebellious mutters began to rise among the small folk. They cursed the crown, cursed the quarantine. They argued that if the gates would not be opened, then the Red Keep should at least distribute grain and protective tonics. But the keep offered little aid. The storehouses in the keep were reserved for the Queen's loyalists, and distribution was minimal. In desperation, mobs ransacked merchant warehouses and noble estates, taking what they could find. Often, they found only infected corpses. The city watch was too few in number and too sickly to contain the lawlessness. Some watchmen decided that if they were likely to die anyway, they might as well turn rogue, steal a bit of food or gold, or claim a house for themselves. Among the desperate populace, a rumor spread that Qyburn, though few knew his name, was the queen's sorcerer, and that this plague was a curse he had unleashed. It was said that he had commanded rats to crawl from the sewers and spread the disease, that he had sacrificed children in dark rituals to the Lord of Darkness, or that he had conjured a demon to haunt the city. These rumors took various shapes depending on who told them, but they all carried a kernel of truth. Someone behind the scenes was orchestrating this horror. The small folk, powerless and stricken by fear, could only blame the Red Keep and the Queen's twisted confidant. A few tried to set the keep ablaze from outside, hurling flaming pitch or shooting flaming arrows at night. But the walls were too high, the defenses too strong. Their attempts ended in a hail of quarrels from crossbows. Inside, Qyburn heard of these attacks and was not surprised. In his own quiet way, he felt a surge of pride. He had orchestrated something that consumed the entire city and rattled the very foundations of power. Still, a part of him recognized that if the city fell completely into anarchy, even Cersei's crown might be meaningless. He occasionally wondered if he should craft a cure, if only to bolster his position at the Queen's side and ascend to real authority as the city's savior. But whenever he considered it, the memory of how meticulously he had concocted this plague returned. It was not an accidental disease, and he had no illusions about how difficult it would be to create a cure. He had used a patchwork of toxins, old blood-borne pathogens, and other arcane influences gleaned from forbidden books. If a cure existed, it would demand more time than the city was likely to survive. Half a year into the quarantine, King's Landing was a shadow of its former self. Perhaps a quarter of its original population remained alive within the walls, and many among them were in some stage of illness. The gloom of winter settled over the city, bringing cold winds that cut through tattered cloaks and broken shutters. Fires burned here and there, both for warmth and for disposal of the dead. Some wards of the city were eerily silent, deserted. Flea Bottom, once teeming with life, however wretched, was reduced to rubble and charred remnants in many places, with occasional pockets of survivors who roamed like specters. The rookeries in the city had largely fallen silent as well. Ravens with messages were rarely sent now, for it was widely believed the city's ravens might themselves carry the plague in fleas or mites. Indeed, a good number of them had died in their cages. Communication with the outside world was minimal, though Qyburn made sure to keep certain ravens alive for his own communications. He rarely sent messages, but he liked to read the occasional raven from far-off lords inquiring about the state of the capital or offering potential alliances. He told the queen only what she needed to hear, that they must focus on containing the sickness, that a final stand was necessary to maintain her rule. In the Red Keep, the winter chill permeated even the grand corridors. Many halls were deserted, as numerous servants had died or fled, leaving dusty floors and tapestries that hung like silent witnesses to the ruin. Cersei's paranoia only grew. She suspected everyone of harboring the plague. She refused to dine in the Great Hall, instead taking meals alone in her solar. She insisted that Qyburn examine each dish for contamination, an odd request, given the nature of the disease. She had dismissed most of her staff, relying on a skeleton crew of watchers who seemed least likely to be infected. A handful of highborn ladies remained, but they were all terrified and uncertain how to comfort their queen. All the while, Qyburn lurked in his hidden chambers beneath the Red Keep. His experiments never ceased. By now, his test subjects included not just criminals but also a few unfortunates from the city who had dared to attempt entry to the keep. He took them, telling the queen he needed fresh samples to pursue a cure. Though the queen might not have openly admitted it, she condoned his atrocities because she believed they might save her. She peered at him with haunted eyes whenever he brought an update, but seldom asked for the details. Qyburn, for his part, was fascinated by how the plague had mutated in the city's population over months of transmission. Some strains appeared more virulent, others less so. He dissected corpses with an almost childlike curiosity, noting how the plague ravaged the lungs, inflamed the brain, and caused organ failure in a pattern of unstoppable progression. One day, as winter's chill sank to its depths, Qyburn emerged from his laboratory to discover that the queen had summoned him urgently. He hurried through the echoing halls and up the winding staircases to her private chambers. He found her waiting at a table, a tapestry of House Lannister draped behind her. She was thinner than he recalled, her cheeks hollow, her eyes carrying dark circles. A brazier in the corner of the room provided some warmth, but not enough to dispel the gloom in her expression. Her voice was strained when she addressed him. She demanded to know if he had made any progress. Qyburn feigned regret, telling her the disease was remarkably resistant to all his efforts. She slammed her hand on the table, her knuckles white. She told him in a trembling voice that she had lost another cousin to the plague, that half the lords and ladies in the keep were bedridden or dead. She had begun to cough at night. She forbade him to speak of it, but he could see fear etched across her features. She was terrified that the plague would claim her as well, and with her, the last vestiges of control in King's Landing. She demanded to know if there was a radical method, some dark magic, some newly discovered concoction, that might protect her. Qyburn kept his face carefully neutral, but inside, he felt a small, twisted satisfaction. He told her there was one method, though it was untested. It involved the extraction of certain vital essences from plague survivors, men and women who had somehow lived through the sickness. Perhaps their blood carried the seeds of immunity, or so he hypothesized. He claimed that if he could isolate these seeds of immunity, distill them into a serum, he might strengthen her own body to resist the disease. It was an outlandish theory, but desperation did not allow for better logic. Cersei clutched this idea. She demanded he find survivors at once, forcibly if need be. She gave him the authority to do whatever was required. Qyburn bowed, saying he would proceed immediately. He had no illusions that this plan would succeed, but it would buy him time and keep the queen reliant on him. He began systematically searching for any known survivors of the plague. Indeed, some existed, rare individuals whose bodies shook off the fever after weeks of suffering. Perhaps they were naturally resistant, or perhaps fortune simply smiled on them. Qyburn's minions within the City Watch hunted these people down, detaining them under force and dragging them to the Red Keep. Some came willingly, enticed by the promise of better living conditions, only to find themselves in Qyburn's laboratory, strapped to a table. He drew their blood, tested them with various chemicals, and for a moment, in a fleeting sense of actual scientific curiosity, he tried to see if indeed there was something in their blood that might neutralize the plague. He found no easy solution. The plague was too complex, its ravages too widespread, and the few survivors often had permanent damage to their lungs or other organs, leaving them weak. Yet Qyburn continued, telling the queen he was close to a breakthrough, forging false hope so she would not turn on him in frustration. He wanted to preserve his position within the keep for as long as possible. Outside, the city had become a patchwork of desolation. Winter winds battered the blackened ruins of houses. Stray dogs roamed in packs, rummaging through debris and feasting on the dead when they could. A handful of determined merchants operated black market stalls, selling everything from rancid salted meats to cheap liquors that promised to ward off illness. Wealthy inhabitants, if any still remained, had retreated behind tall walls and private guards, though even in those enclaves, the plague lurked. The quarantine remained in effect, enforced by what remained of the City Watch. But there was little point now, so few people were well enough to leave, and the plague had done its worst within the city's confines. At times, bands of desperate souls tried to breach the gates and flee, only to be shot down or driven back. The Watch was brutal in its enforcement. Some men even found a cruel satisfaction in it. City walls that once protected the seat of royal power now served as a barrier to keep death locked inside. Beyond those walls, the rest of Westeros took note. The roads to King's Landing were mostly deserted. Most lords had no desire to come near, and peasants gave it a wide berth. War or rebellion might once have threatened the city, but now it was cursed by disease, a fate worse than any siege. Months more passed. The The plague had devoured so many that it began to slow simply because there were fewer people left to infect. Corpses were still carted daily, but the numbers had diminished. That was little comfort to those who remained, for the city had become a tomb for tens of thousands. Smoke clung to the rooftops, a permanent haze of funeral pyres and hearth fires. The living whispered about whether the seven had abandoned them, or if this was punishment for the city's sins. The faith was as powerless now as ever, its illusions of divine protection shattered by the unrelenting death that spared no one, not even septas or septons. Within the Red Keep, Qyburn carried on his work. The queen had grown frail, though she struggled to maintain a semblance of regal poise. She clung to the illusion of rulership, summoning the remnants of her court to hear trifling matters. Often, the chambers were nearly empty, and the few who did attend coughed into kerchiefs. The queen had not fallen gravely ill yet, but her cough was persistent. She drank Qyburn's potions religiously, trusting they would protect her. For all Qyburn knew, she might be a slow-burn victim, or perhaps she was genetically lucky. In some, the plague lingered subclinically for weeks before its final assault. Qyburn had no illusions about the eventual fate of King's Landing. Even if the plague began to fade, the city was wrecked. Much of its population had perished, the infrastructure was in ruins, and the once glorious seat of the realm was a spectral shell. In a sense, he had succeeded far beyond what he had initially imagined. He could not help but wonder what the rest of Westeros would do. If rumors were true, neighboring lords had begun to gather forces, not to rescue the city, but to keep it sealed off, to ensure no one from the city threatened their lands with infection. King's Landing was effectively quarantined not just by royal decree but by the will of the realm. Still, Qyburn's ambitions were not fully extinguished. He had toyed with the idea of escaping with his research and unleashing another wave of pestilence elsewhere. But he was unsure if he could slip past the city's gates without meeting the same fate as others who tried. He also calculated that if the plague did eventually weaken, someone would be needed to pick up the pieces, to restore something resembling order. Could that be him, guiding a new monarchy from the shadows? Or would some external lord march in with an army and cast him down? For the moment, he bided his time, continuing to appear as the queen's loyal confidant, the man working tirelessly for a cure. If the day came that the city opened its gates, or if it collapsed entirely, he would be ready with the knowledge gleaned from months of horrifying study. The city sank into one final wave of death as winter deepened. The cold thinned the ranks of those who were already weakened by starvation and sickness. Fires consumed more ruined districts, set either accidentally by those trying to warm themselves or deliberately by those seeking to erase the plague's hiding places. Tensions between the living sword. Street gangs fought over bits of salvage or sacks of grain. Murders abounded as desperate men and women turned on one another, hoping to live another day. The queen's authority scarcely extended beyond the keep's walls. She gave orders to the city watch, but their numbers were a pale shadow, scattered across a city too large for them to control. More often than not, they stayed close to the keep, protecting themselves, letting the outer districts fend for themselves. One dreary morning, Qyburn ventured outside the keep in disguise, as he sometimes did to see the extent of the plague's final throes. He made his way down the empty thoroughfares. The thick coat he wore offered little insulation against the biting wind. There was no hustle of commerce, no calls of vendors, no pressing crowds. Instead, occasional shapes hunched in doorways or moved furtively from alley to alley. The stench of decay was strong, though many of the corpses had either been burned or devoured by rats and dogs long ago. Snow flurries drifted down, blanketing the rooftops in a grayish white. The city was unnaturally silent except for the distant caw of crows that perched on the rubble. As he passed the charred remains of a tavern, he glimpsed a cluster of survivors gathered around a barrel fire. Their eyes flicked up, gaunt faces etched with suspicion. He coughed once in the cold, and they all recoiled, some stepping back, others reaching for weapons. He realized that fear of infection had turned everyone into a potential enemy. He muttered a placation and hurried on, leaving them in the swirl of snow. Further down, he found a courtyard once used for public gatherings, now deserted except for a single figure wearing a makeshift mask. A woman stooped over a small body on the ground, possibly her child. She looked up with wild, reddened eyes and spat at Qyburn. He saw that the child was cold and lifeless, perhaps claimed by the plague or by hunger. He said nothing and stepped around them. The woman whispered a hoarse prayer, half in delirium, calling upon the mother to shield the child. She might have coughed or maybe sobbed, but Qyburn did not stop to listen. He pressed on toward Flea Bottom, or what remained of it. Here, the flames had long since died out, leaving skeletons of buildings. A few walls still stood, blackened timbers leaning precariously. The ground was littered with ash and debris. He smelled something rank, like rotting fish, and realized the sewers had backed up again, possibly clogged with detritus and corpses. Sickness in the air was almost tangible. He saw footprints in the ash, telling him that some survivors prowled here, though the streets were deserted at the moment. He paused at what had once been the Street of Flower, now a ghostly ruin of collapsed storefronts. It was here that the plague had first made its presence widely known, the whorehouse that closed suddenly, the bakers who coughed crimson. To think that from this vantage point, he had watched the slow, inevitable meltdown of an entire city. He let his gaze linger, mulling over how tenuous civilization truly was when confronted with an invisible killer. A swirl of wind and ash whipped around him. He pulled his cloak tighter, feeling a sensation he rarely acknowledged, something akin to an uneasy awe at the scale of destruction he had wrought. He made his way back to the Red Keep by midday. The sun was hidden behind gray clouds, casting a pall over the city's battered skyline. Once inside, he ascended to his laboratory, storing the small samples he had gathered. Scrapings from the rubble, bits of cloth from deceased victims. He would examine them later under candlelight, see if the plague still thrived in those so-called hotspots. Even after all these months, he would not stop his investigations. Knowledge was power, but an urgent summons reached him soon after. Circe's last living handmaiden, an ashen-faced girl of perhaps 17, gasped that the queen was unwell, bedbound, her cough worsening. Qyburn rushed to the queen's chambers, entering to find a scene of haggard desperation. Circe lay in her grand bed, drenched in sweat despite the chill. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face drawn. She coughed into a stained handkerchief, leaving flecks of red that smeared across her lips. A wave of tremors shook her body, and she moaned in pain. Qyburn approached carefully, aware that even as the cause of this plague, he was not entirely immune. He had taken some precautions with his own experimental tonics, but there were no guarantees. "Qyburn," she rasped, fixing him with a glare that still carried a hint of her once imperious nature. "Where is my cure?" He knelt by her bedside. "I have something that may help," he lied. "It is an experimental serum derived from the blood of survivors. It may grant you some measure of resistance." He produced a vial of murky fluid. It was a mixture of his many trials, likely worthless. But he could not let her see that. She was too desperate to refuse. She gestured impatiently, and he helped her lift her head. She drank it, grimacing at the bitter taste, then lay back, eyes closed. "Will it cure me?" she asked weakly. Qyburn set the empty vial on the bedside table. "We must give it time, Your Grace. It may slow the progression and give your body a chance to fight." She opened her eyes to stare at him. "If I die, Qyburn, you will burn with me in the 7 hells." He inclined his head. "I serve you loyally, my queen. I pray for your swift recovery." She coughed again, more blood spattering the linens. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters. The gloom of the day seemed fitting for a city that had become a mass grave. Qyburn stood and summoned the handmaiden, instructing her to bring fresh bedding and water to keep the queen warm. The girl scurried off, though her face showed she believed none of it would help. Alone with the queen, Qyburn studied her a moment. This was the woman who had once commanded armies, who had orchestrated the destruction of her rivals, who had placed her trust in him to accomplish tasks others feared. In her eyes now he saw only mortal terror. She coughed again, a rivulet of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. He dabbed at it with a cloth, trying to project a gentle bedside manner. She clutched his wrist with surprising strength. "You must save the city," she gasped, though her words were garbled by the rattle in her chest. "Restore order, my throne." Qyburn did not answer, because there was nothing to say. The city lay in ruins, and what remained of the throne was overshadowed by plague. He recalled how his entire scheme had begun as a series of small experiments, culminating in a wave of infection that had consumed the capital. Now, at the apex of destruction, the queen who had placed so much faith in him was dying. He considered whether there was any point in trying to preserve her life. Perhaps if she survived, she would remain the figurehead, and he could continue to rule from the shadows. But the plague had no mercy, not even for kings or queens. Cersei's eyes fluttered shut again as she drifted into a restless slumber. Qyburn stood there, listening to the crackle of the brazier and the rasp of her breath. He wondered if her survival might hinge on a chance mutation or the partial immunity from his worthless serum. Yet he suspected that death hovered at her bedside, ready to claim the last great figure in King's Landing's hierarchy. If the queen died, who would contest him? The city was crippled. The great houses might eventually march in, but until then, Qyburn would do as he pleased. Days passed in a blur. The queen lingered, her condition seesawing between fleeting moments of lucidity and fits of fevered coughing. Qyburn administered more potions, ensuring each was more desperate than the last, each laden with exotic ingredients and incantations that had no real bearing. In truth, he was uncertain if the plague had begun to recede in her body or if it was merely toying with her. Meanwhile, outside her chambers, the Red Keep was starved of leadership. The handful of courtiers who remained tried to keep the minimal functions of governance alive, but the city had collapsed. At length, in the dead of night, Cersei worsened again. By flickering candlelight, Qyburn observed her tossing in her sweat-soaked bed, eyes rolling with delirium, breath coming in shallow gasps. She spat blood onto the floor, and Qyburn noted her nails had taken on a bluish tint, a sign of failing circulation. She called out for her children, her voice breaking, some hallucination prompting her to believe they were at her bedside. She cursed Tyrion, cursed her enemies, cursed the plague. Then, with one final, drawn-out exhalation, her body fell still. Qyburn pressed his hand against her neck, feeling for a pulse. There was none. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, sightless. He let out a soft breath. The queen was dead. In other times, that news would have shaken the realm. A monstrous war of succession might have ignited. Now, in the plague-ravaged city, it was almost anticlimactic. Qyburn closed her eyes gently, reflecting that he should prepare some statement for the few who remained in the keep. He would not declare her death immediately. It might be wise to keep the city in the dark until he decided how best to move next. He left her chamber in the pre-dawn gloom, instructing the lone guard outside to allow no one entry. The corridors felt emptier than ever. His footsteps echoed along the stone floors. The illusions he had woven, the manipulations he had orchestrated, they had all culminated in this. He had effectively undone King's Landing, bringing it to its knees with plague, and now the queen was gone. The city was quarantined, destroyed from within, and he alone possessed the knowledge of how it all began. As dawn broke, a sickly light filtered through the windows, revealing a capital on the brink of final collapse. The air smelled of ash and stale death. Qyburn stood upon a balcony overlooking the courtyard, which was deserted save for a handful of half-dead watchmen. He turned his gaze toward the city beyond the walls, imagining the deserted streets, the pockets of ragged survivors, and the untended corpses in lonely corners. The plague's unstoppable hand had done its work, leaving behind a realm forever changed. At length, he descended into his private laboratory, where the moans of dying prisoners mingled with the hiss of braziers. He approached a worktable scattered with notes and vials, the fruit of months of dark experimentation. He set a candle in a sconce, illuminating them. Somewhere in these scribbled pages were the details of how to replicate the plague, how to refine or even escalate its lethality. A twisted triumph, yes, but one he guarded jealously. He began to gather them, sifting through reams of parchment spattered with blood and ink. He recalled each step of his plan. The initial infected child used to test the viability, the disguised boy with the false bottom jar that spread the contagion in the apothecaries, the infiltration of the City Watch. It had all been so fragile at the outset. Now it stood as a testament to what he could achieve unopposed. He lingered on a single, chilling thought. This was but one city in a vast continent. He turned his gaze to a globe of glass he kept on a shelf, a memento from his days traveling before he lost his maester's chain. It was a map of Westeros etched in swirling dyes. King's Landing was but a small mark on that map. He wondered if, given the chance, he could replicate his experiment in Old Town, or in Lannisport, or even across the Narrow Sea. If the knowledge of his plague was harnessed, the entire realm could be brought to heel under the threat of disease alone. But that was a dream for another day, if that day ever came. For now, King's Landing lay quarantined, and he was as much a prisoner here as any other soul, albeit one who relished his captive dominion. If outside forces eventually marched upon the city, they would find a husk, a ruin haunted by plague and a smattering of survivors too scarred to mount any true defense. Qyburn did not fear them. Let them come if they dared. Perhaps the plague would still linger enough to greet them. He pulled up a chair, lit several more candles, and immersed himself in his notes. The moans and rattles of his dying test subjects receded into background noise. He methodically organized every scrap of knowledge gleaned from the plague's progression, every detail about its symptoms and its means of transmission. He had been thorough, adding new observations each time the disease manifested a mutation. Now that it had ravaged the city, he had a wealth of data that no one else in the Seven Kingdoms possessed. At times, he chuckled darkly to himself, imagining the Citadel's horror if they knew the extent of his work. They had cast him out for his boundary-pushing experiments, and now he had surpassed them in ways they could never have foreseen. He had tamed a plague, in a manner of speaking, harnessed it to accomplish an unprecedented feat of destruction. In another life, he might have been revered as a brilliant pioneer of medical knowledge, if only he had used his talents to cure rather than to kill. The hours slipped by. He heard no commotion in the keep, no footsteps running through the halls. The guard was likely standing watch outside the Queen's chambers, suspecting nothing yet. At some point, the handmaiden would discover the Queen was dead. Perhaps soon the rumor would spread. Maybe it would incite what remained of the City Watch to flee or attempt to seize the keep. But Qyburn doubted it. By now, loyalty and fear were all that bound them, and even those were frayed. At last, Qyburn rose from his seat. He made his way to a corner of the lab where a large brass-bound chest stood. Within it, he kept certain hidden vials, the most concentrated versions of the plague, sealed away for future use. He tested the lid, found it locked as he'd left it. Removing a key from a pouch around his neck, he unlocked the chest and gazed upon the row of glass containers carefully nestled in straw. Each contained a shimmering fluid, the color of dried blood and bile, waiting to be unleashed if ever needed again. He smiled, imagining how the future might unfold. He closed the chest, locked it. For now, the city lay in a quarantined hush, the plague's worst days behind it, but its aftermath even grimmer. He would remain here, a solitary master of a corpse-filled capital, an unholy caretaker with knowledge gleaned from suffering and death. The memory of how it all began would never leave him. A single idea taking root in his mind, an experiment nurtured in the dark corners of the Red Keep, culminating in the downfall of King's Landing. He thought of the Queen's final words, her demand that he save the city. In a twisted sense, it was his city now, though salvation was not what he had delivered. What happened next would be up to him, if indeed there was a next. He walked to a narrow window slit and gazed out over the distant towers, half shrouded in winter's gloom. Even the crows had grown silent, as if the city was too grim a feast for them now. In the hush, Qyburn's mind spun with possibilities. Perhaps a day would come when the city might limp back to life, when caravans dared approach the gates. Then again, the plague might still haunt these streets, picking off anyone foolish enough to return. He pictured the outside lords, each with their own petty ambitions and armies, eyeing King's Landing from afar, wondering if the plague had burned itself out or if it remained a cursed place. He wondered if, in their ignorance, they might eventually muster an army to break the quarantine and march into the city, expecting easy conquest. Let them. They would find only ashes, ruin, and the lingering specter of disease. If they confronted him, he would wield what knowledge he had, perhaps bargaining for safe passage or for a new role in their courts. Or he might simply vanish, slinking away into the shadows with his chest of deadly secrets, prepared to repeat his experiment in some other domain. For now, the plague had done its work thoroughly, and King's Landing would remain under quarantine, sealed off from the rest of the world. The once thriving capital was reduced to quiet streets, roving dogs, and a handful of survivors breathing shallow prayers that winter might purge the disease. Qyburn withdrew from the window, letting the chill of the stones seep into him. In that moment, he felt neither triumph nor remorse, only a profound stillness, as if the plague had stripped away the city's soul and left behind a hollow echo in the streets and in his own chest. He returned to his notes, picking up a quill. There was more to record, more to analyze. His spidery handwriting scrawled across the parchment by candlelight. It might be months, even years, before a new power stepped into this vacuum. By then, his research would be complete, and he would decide how best to shape the remnants of King's Landing or to move on. And so, in the heart of the quarantined city, where the dying embers of civilization gave off their final glow, Qyburn wrote. His plague had changed the course of history in the capital, a silent invasion that had claimed the high and the low, the righteous and the wicked. Should the city ever recover, it would never forget the year the plague turned the streets into graveyards, nor the name of the Queen's dark confidant who, in hushed whispers, was said to have conjured death out of curiosity and ambition. Winter's breath sighed across the rooftops, carrying ash and the smell of old fires. The hush was absolute, broken only by the faint scratch of Qyburn's quill as he continued his testament of horrors. The city beyond lay under a pall, quarantined. By decree and by necessity, its gates shut, its squares empty, its people decimated. If the stories of King's Landing were ever told again, they would speak of how death reigned unchecked, how the proud capital was humbled, and how Qyburn, the outcast scholar turned master of disease, had orchestrated its downfall. And still he wrote, a solitary figure in the flicker of candlelight, chronicling the final pages of a city's darkest chapter. The flame of the candle danced in the stale air, casting his elongated shadow across the walls, a silent witness to the knowledge he had gleaned and the suffering he had wrought. So ended the tale of King's Landing's quarantine in the throes of Qyburn's plague, a tragedy of ambition and horror that left behind a silent city and a single man's unholy legacy.